I'd like to welcome you all to this event here on a Friday afternoon. I'm Todd Lawrence. I'm from the English department, and I'm also faculty in the program in American Culture and Difference. And so I want to welcome you to this special event to celebrate the publication of my colleague and friend, Dr. Kanishka Chowdury's second book, Human Rights Discourse in the Post-9/11 Age. So we talked about this event, what it would look like, how we would do this, and we kind of hope it will just be sort of interesting conversation. I have lots of questions on 3 pieces of paper that I can ask him, but I'm hoping that maybe the questions will just sort of fade away and we'll just have a conversation. Who knows what will happen? But we just want to have a conversation about this book, which was just published in the fall as part of Paul Graham Macmillan's Human Rights Intervention series. Dr. Chowdhury, as you probably all know, is faculty in the Department of English, and he directs the program in American Culture and Difference. He's a cultural theorist, political economist, critical theorist, a literary and film scholar. I'm stopping there. There's more stuff after that, but I'm just going to stop, among other things. Suffice it to say, he's one of the smartest people I know, and I've yet to stump him asking him questions, so that should come in handy here. This is his second book. His first book was called The New India, Citizenship, Subjectivity, and Economic Liberation. That was published in 2011. In addition to those 2 books, he's published numerous articles in publications like South Asian Review, Cultural Logic, Cultural Critique, New Formations, and Counterpunch. And I think he might be the most proud of Counterpunch, maybe? I don't know. That's just me sort of projecting. But this new book offers an important intervention into the global context of human rights discourse with a specific focus on its, quote, absence of attention to economic questions. Now, that is the most sort of basic way that that's formulated in the book, so that's why I quoted that there. He's going to be able to talk about this in numerous different permutations through the course of this conversation, I hope. So I'm just going to start off and ask some questions, but let's first give a round of applause for our guest, Dr. Chowdhury. All right, so, Kanishka.
Can we just go home now?
Yes, sir.
I think after an introduction like that, I'd rather just stop right now.
Well, as Carrie Miller does on Minnesota Public Radio, I'll ask you, are first names okay?
Yes.
Right? I'll call you
first
Kanishka.
names are
All
okay,
right.
yeah.
So, just to start off, can you give us a sense of what you mean when you say human rights discourse? What are we talking about in the book when you say human rights discourse?
Okay, and before I get started, let me just give a very, very warm thank you to all of you for being here. I'm sure you have better things to do on a Friday afternoon, and I'm sure we're all exhausted by the end of the week. So thank you very much for being here. And thank you to Todd for plowing through my book in the middle of the semester when he has 1,500 of different things to do. So I really appreciate that. And finally, thanks to Andy Lead, without whom no event can possibly take place because he organizes it so well. So having said that, going back to your question, what do I mean by discourse, human rights discourse? So one of the things I've tried to do in this book is really, as someone who's interested in language and issues of language, I've looked at how discourse constructs not just our versions of reality, but also how it constructs subjects. And so one of the main questions in my book is how does existing dominant language about victims of injustice create a particular subject? And so that discourse in itself is what I've looked at. And now, so partly, one thing to keep in mind here is I have been analyzing texts that are all very much allied to the cause. These are not texts that are in any way hostile to human rights work. That would be like shooting fish in a barrel if I went after those people. So these are documents. These are the work of activists. These are organizations that I find myself politically close to, aligned to. But what I found while I was looking at their work is that because they've sort of bought into a certain kind of discursive, normative sort of idea of how not just how the world is. They are also, therefore, constructing subjects in a particular way. And so it affects the work that they do. Because the language determines the actions that you take to address the injustices that you observe. So that was my main motivation in going into this project, is not so much to critique human rights work, because let me say right up front that the work that a lot of people are doing, whether it's a doctor for Médecins Sans Frontières, or somebody working at the border, U.S.-Mexico border, or anyone who's doing really dangerous work as a human rights activist in a war-torn area, I have nothing but admiration for them. And it is not my work to critique what they're doing. So that's not the point of the book. The point of the book is to try to understand how the language that human rights workers use to some extent determine their actions. So that's what I mean by discourse. Discourse as a way to formulate the world, to formulate subjects, and then to create sort of a reality out of that.
All right, I'm going off script already. So
yeah, sure.
I'm wondering if you can talk about how the work that you've done previously in your career sort of leads you to the work the research that's in this book, because you're in an English department. If people don't know anything about English departments, they must think that it's only about reading Dickens and things like that. How did your training, how does your previous research lead you to this project?
Yeah, so I try to read widely in a number of disciplines, and a lot of the so-called literary theorists that I read, whether it's Jacques Rancière or Zizek or Wendy Brown or whoever, these are people who are invested in all kinds of disciplines. They have their feet in many areas, political theory, sociology, women's studies, cultural studies. So my graduate training, even though it was in an English department, my dissertation was in cultural studies work. So I have been trained to sort of do cultural studies, but I find I find disciplines too confining. And so I like to look across disciplines to see how perhaps a text acquires new meanings once you bring a certain kind of different lens to it. So as far as my training goes, I think I've been lucky at St. Thomas that I've had very supportive chairs who've allowed me to pretty much teach what I want, and incredibly receptive students who've taken my courses. So when I sit down to do scholarship, it doesn't seem strange for me to think about film or to think about a literary text. These are, for me, not separable objects, photographs.
Mm-hmm. So the concept of text is very broad for you.
Right.
Yeah. So to focus to the book, you start with your sort of understanding or thinking about human rights discourse with the UN Declaration of Human Rights in 1948. And so, when I was reading, and we've talked about this, it could make sense to start with the Greeks or the Romans, or it could make sense to start with the Enlightenment period, because that seems like to be one of the major times when the free individual subject is being conceived of. Why do you begin with the UN Universal Declaration of Human Rights? Why is that the place that you start when you're talking about human rights discourse?
Okay. And I would say that you go back a lot further than the Greeks and the Romans.
Oh.
You go back to the Hammurabi Code in Mesopotamia, you go back to the Sumerian civilization. The concept of rights is something that's certainly also in the holy texts, whether it's the Quran, the Bible, so on and so forth. When we think about rights, we do usually think of Enlightenment rights, of course, the rights of man, French Revolution, and the United States Bill of Rights and the Constitution. But I think for me, the UN Declaration is pivotal because it is the first time the idea of rights is taken seriously at a global level. It is the document, the UN Declaration of 1948, comes about, as I'm sure all of you know, because of the Second World War, because of the Holocaust, because of the atrocities perpetrated by the Nazis. And so, the world realized that you cannot let one country make up its own laws, and sort of break, larger universal human laws. So the timing of that particular declaration, 1948, is crucial because it is when sort of quote unquote the modern world comes into being after the Second World War. It is not a law. The UN Declaration is not a law. It's a declaration. It's what is called a customary sort of spirit of the law that most countries on this planet abide by its principles, but there is no such, the declaration is not a legal document.
Sorry, there's a spider on there. I'm sorry.
Okay.
I thought very long and hard what to do. Okay, go ahead.
No, that's all right. I would have not screamed too loudly. I think that, so yeah, I mean, I think it's the first time that the idea of rights is taken seriously enough to coordinate something at a global level, to bring all the nations together. And of course, one of the things I talk about in my book is that it goes wrong from day one, partly because of the politics of the Cold War. Right after the war, they're very different constituents about who thinks that this is appropriate or not. Eleanor Roosevelt, who was the lead person for the United States, had very set ideas about how this should work. Civil rights were given more importance than economic rights, and so on and so forth. So it was a very problematic document from the very beginning. And if you think about 1948, there are already many global sort of issues going on which are not taken into account. So there are a lot of absences in the document. And at this point in 1948, there are still millions and millions of people living under the yoke of European colonization. So, the idea that all the signatories who are, sort of saying, yes, we should all abide by these rules, whether it's France, who has colonies in North Africa and Southeast Asia, or Britain, who has colonies all over Africa and the rest of the world. This is a basic problem from day one, that you're abiding by these principles which are not being enacted in 3/4 of the world, right?
So when we think about the U.S. Constitution and the Declaration of Independence, like the documents of the foundation of this country, and myself being an African American studies person, we think about the sort of inherent contradictions, and you're talking about that now. And we think about subsequent documents that come out, state constitutions, which are worded such that they allow for segregation and discrimination to continue to take place. I'm just wondering if the Declaration itself, the language that it uses, can you read it and get a sense that it's specifically they're trying to dodge language that would hold them to account for the way that they are actually treating people in their colonial possessions, or do they just act like we don't have those?
Right. I mean, I think the concept of self-determination, which you would think would be a fundamental human right? I mean, how does a European country who is denying self-determination to millions of people, sign on a document which directly contradicts that? So the language is very blurry. There are ways in which the language kind of obfuscates, what freedoms are, what liberties are. People under your jurisdictions, they use phrases like that. So yeah, I think at the heart of it, there is already a instability in the language that allows for certain kinds of violations to happen, I think, or to be inherently logical to it. I mean, so I think there are some constituent problems in the document itself. Yes, very much so.
Is there? I mean, so 1948, we're thinking about, or people, I suppose, have been thinking for, almost half a century about what it means to be modern, like what that is about. Because you talk about how human rights discourse constructs subjects, does the Declaration in some way contribute to the construction of a modern subject, or has that been done before we get to that point?
I mean, that's a good question. I mean, I think there is a sense in which the idea of a universal set of rules is part of the schematic of modernity, right? I mean, I don't think you can escape it. I mean, there are lots of documents, I suppose one could encounter that similarly, talks about how you come into modernity. But I think this is where part of my problem is, that the subject of human rights is being constructed to be assimilated into a certain paradigm of development, of progress, of modernity. And that paradigm is primarily constructed by European powers at that particular point. And this is a legacy of that declaration, that even today, the whole problem of the savior is usually in the West and the saved is usually in the global South. You have that power inequality in terms of how this kind of work gets done. So I think in terms of modernity, the modern subject is a privileged subject of a certain kind of experience. And that experience, in my mind, has largely been dictated and formulated by those who created this document. So yeah.
So the other part of your title of your book is Human Rights Discourse in the Post-9/11 Age.
Mm-hmm.
Why the Post-9/11 Age? What is significant about, I mean, obviously, there's obvious significance to that event, but why the Post-9/11 Age?
Yeah. So, I mean, I suppose the one thing I would say is that I don't want to give a sort of false weight and a sort of hegemonic value to something that's just US-centered, and that wasn't the intention by choosing 9/11. However, having said that, 9/11 is not just a US event, it's a global event. It had consequences on many, many parts of the world, and it continues to have consequences in many parts of the world. But it opened the doors to seeing rights language being reevaluated and rethought in the context of the war on terror. Certainly, the violations in Guantanamo prison, Abu Ghraib, the conducting of the war in Iraq and Afghanistan. But also other things, I would say, the attention to a surveillance society. I think we are all very much conscious now that we are constantly under surveillance, and I think the idea of rights and surveillance is something that's become much more significant post 9/11. The other thing, the reason I chose 9/11 as a kind of marker is that I think in the last 2 decades, the acceleration of wealth accumulation has changed dramatically. Inequality has risen sharply. As of 2019, 26 people on this planet own as much as 3.8 billion people. And even 3 years back, it was 62 people. So we're living in a planet that is, inequality is, it's just incredible and crazy. The cost of women who are doing care labor across the world is $10 trillion. Free care labor, $10 trillion, which is roughly 50 times the annual turnover of Apple. Capitalism could not function without free care labor done by women. Now, these are, I could go on and on about statistics, but I think for me, the last 20 years and how this inequality has sharpened has made human rights discourse particularly problematic, because on the one hand, you have a discourse which is trying substantially to address such inequalities, but on the other hand, it is also trying to manage them, right? In a sense, it is a rationalizing machine for inequality. So one of the things I talk about in my book at great length is the collapse of the sweatshop building in Bangladesh in 2013, where 1,200 people died. And really, most of the reaction, was quite predictable. and it was about the sort of outrage at the lack of regulations and all of that stuff. But no one really got to the heart of what the problem is, which is why is this being done? Whose ends are these factories meeting? Mostly women who were sewing clothes in that factory were sewing it for Primark, for Walmart, for Mango, for all these companies. So what does human rights do with a situation like that? Most of the discourse was about, again, outrage that the building wasn't properly coded, or the management was irresponsible, or that U.S. companies should be more active in regulating things, and as consumers we should boycott goods that come from such sweatshops. But this is not going to change anything, right? I mean, this is not the problem. The problem is at the heart of how value is being extracted at incredibly low wages. And unless the discourse goes to the heart of that matter, for me, that's where the fundamental contradiction is. And this has just been sharpened in the last 2 decades, I think. And that's why 9/11. Other than the sort of cataclysmic, effect of that tragedy, and surveillance and war and all of that, which I've talked about already, but also I think just wealth and the financialization of the globe is a huge factor. And the last thing I'll say is migration. I think in the last 20 years, as you all know, the current quote-unquote refugee crisis, 70 million displaced people across the world, right? And sadly, it's the time when most needed is the time when the United States has reduced its number to the lowest ever. Now it's 18,000. In 2016, Obama had raised it to 100,000 because of the Syrian conflict. And then it went to 50,000 in 17, 30,000 in 18, and I think now it's 18,000. And of course, applying for refugee status doesn't mean you'll get it. So the chances of people actually coming into this country as refugees is very low. So I'd say all of these factors are human rights factors, crisis. And so the discourse itself is being used a lot. It's being referred to a lot. It's something that, in my mind, needs to be analyzed, needs to be looked at. If we are to really do work, if we are to fix the inequalities of the world, then we must have the language that prepares us to look directly and deeply into such matters. If we only look at what's transparent, what's on the surface, you're not going to fix the labor problem in Bangladesh by having better regulations. Sure, you might save some lives for a year or two, but then it doesn't solve the fundamental human rights problem, which is that workers are being exploited.
Can you talk more about the ways, because there's sort of one way of thinking about this, which is that human rights discourse leaves something out. But the other way that I think you've more been talking about it, is that human rights discourse actually constructs something or shapes the how we think about something. And so I was wondering if you could talk about, for example, with microfinance and sort of women in the global South being constructed in this particular way, and how specifically that sort of pushes us away from thinking about the actual sort of system of accumulation of capital as sort of being responsible for their poverty, right? You know what I'm saying?
Yeah, so I've written, one of my chapters looks closely at the phenomenon of microcredit, which is something that is quite, used widely in the so-called developing world. These are programs, mostly Western programs, but some indigenous to countries themselves, where women particularly are given small loans to start their quote-unquote own businesses. And to celebrate the entrepreneurial spirit and what have you. However, again, the way the subject of this particular right is being constructed is through that narrative of progress and development, which sees the only sort of forward motion through this kind of assimilation into a market economy, assimilation into a consuming subject. Again, very much, within the parameters and the logic of, what we think is the best way to move forward. And, if you think about microcredit programs in really poor countries, most of the time, if a woman gets a loan to, let's say, start a so-called small business, if there is not proper health care, if there is some kind of disaster of some kind, or if there is a crisis, that money is going to be spent on that. And many of these societies also, women don't have control of the money, and that money is often taken away from them by their husbands or partners. So unless you look to the larger context within which these kinds of human rights work is being done, it's just sort of very, very myopic to think that giving somebody some money is going to dramatically change the kind of destiny of this person, because the overall structure of the society remains unchanged. 10,000 people die every day because they don't have access to health care. 10,000 people. And these are completely preventable deaths. Right? So that's the reality of the world we live in. When some big entrepreneur says, well, giving laptops to poor children in Rwanda is going to solve their debt problem, you have to wonder what he has been drinking. It's not, but then there is an ideology to it, right? The ideology is that progress, development, all of this comes through this typical narratives of consumerism, of incorporation into the market economy and modernity and all of these things. So again, it's, it goes back to how human rights work is hindered by human rights language. Mm-hmm. If you buy into those kind of paradigms of development and progress and modernity, then the kind of work we do is indirectly affected by it.
Mm-hmm. So even as much as you said at the beginning, this, and you say this in the book several times, like, I'm not criticizing the people who do this work. I'm not criticizing the work that they do, but you're also saying like that work is not effective at getting at the problem, right?
Right.
You can say both of those things at the same time.
You could, and I'm not just making this up. In my research, I talked to a number of people who work for NGOs, non-governmental organizations, and they evince the same kind of frustration that we are not able to do certain things because of the way we have to write grants, for instance. Foundations won't give us money unless we write it in the language that they have approved. So they are already, pushing a rock up the hill, because even if they want to do certain kind of work, that rock lies in the way. So this is not just what I think. This is what, again, people have said to me that we want to, if I'm working with, let's say, sex workers in a city where want to work directly with women, what kind of work am I able to do is dictated by that foundation's idea of what, emancipatory work is. Mm-hmm. For them it might be just handing out condoms. Mm-hmm. But is it solving the fact that, their children have no access to schools or healthcare?
And there's always language around that thing that they're trying to do, right? Like you talk about with regard to the microfinance, it's empowerment, and
right.
I assume with other kinds of work that NGOs and nonprofits
right.
do, they will create this sort of language around
right.
it, which both dictates what they can do and keeps them from doing other things, right?
Yeah.
Prevents them.
And I think, if you want to see a popular manifestation of this, I'd say what I'd call the TED Talkification of intellectual discourse, where, if you've ever seen a TED Talk, it's this 10 minutes of wonderful visionary stuff, which is going to solve all our problems. And really no one really gets in depth into some of these, much more nuanced and complex situations. But it sounds good. Um, you know, this solar cup is going to solve third world debt. That sounds good, right? Even though it's completely outrageously impossible. So again, it's in my mind, the words we use, such as empowerment, which is a much overused word. What does it really mean? What does it mean, and what do we want it to mean? But we have to use that word when we apply for a grant, and just throw it in there, because that's what people recognize. If you don't talk about women without using the word empowerment, then what work are you really doing? No one's prepared to really question that. So it becomes this easy template rather than anything else.
You talk a lot, just sort of piggybacking off that, you talk a lot about how human rights discourse focuses on the individual rather than the collective struggle, right? And I think I am getting this from the chapter on animals, people, right? That I think you point to that text as maybe the text that most sort of resists that focus on the individual as opposed to the collective, but you still talk about how it sort of comes up short in some ways. But can you talk about that, sort of the individual versus the collective, and how human rights discourse sort of pushes us in one direction?
So I'll go back to something you asked me about, the Universal Declaration. And so one of the things that becomes enshrined in that declaration is the rights of the individual. And this is one of the reasons a lot of the Eastern Bloc countries resisted, signing on to that, because they had a whole different ideological agenda, right? So yes, I think a lot of the human rights language is about individual rights and individual freedoms and so on and so forth. And I think that clearly, again, affects the kind of work we do, because we don't see any point really in collective struggle. And the kind of political mobilization communities across the world are partaking in. We're living in an incredible moment in world history, right? There's political struggle going on in Chile. There's political struggle going on in Lebanon, in Iraq, in Hong Kong, Algeria. This is not anything organized by any sort of simple idea of what someone's rights are. Sometimes it takes a very small thing. In Chile it was the transit fare, right? But it opened the doors to all kinds of other kinds of inequities in that society, which made people come out of the street, right? You could argue that one of the reasons the governor lost the race in Kentucky a couple of days ago is because of the Kentucky teachers and the immensely incredible work they did in a very conservative state. So I think that, that spirit of collective rebellion, of sort of trying to change the conditions of your life, if there's so much emphasis on the individual and individual rights, I think you lose a sense of that potential for large social transformation. And what I'm afraid of is a lot of human rights work is not interested in large social transformation. I think they're interested in individual gain. And while there's nothing wrong with that, of course we want individual gain, it does inhibit social movements from gathering strength. And many of the NGOs, in fact, consciously work to suppress collective struggle. I will say, however, that there are also NGOs that encourage it, but certainly some NGOs discourage collective struggle.
If I'm being super highly cynical, could you say that one of the reasons is because it wouldn't be in their interest to encourage collective struggle, because it would essentially stop the thing that they are engaged in? Like it would cease their reason for being?
I mean, this is complicated because one of the reasons that there's been a huge sort of upsurge in the number of NGOs that exist in the world today is precisely because the state has stopped doing what it's supposed to do, which is take care of the welfare of its own people, right? This is happening across the world. It's happening in Latin America. It's happening everywhere, right? The state has abdicated its responsibility to its own people. And this is the gap in which NGOs come in. And so to some extent, NGOs are filling a necessary gap, but they're also, in a way, allowing the state to step back. And this is something that's happened for 4 decades of neoliberalism, right? I mean, social spending has dramatically gone down, whether it's Britain or Chile or wherever, South Africa. All the programs that are connected to social welfare, education, housing, so health, so on and so forth, have been cut back. And so NGOs have come in to fill these gaps, and in some cases they're extremely necessary. And again, I'm not denying that some of this work is necessary, but on the other hand, what is really ultimately, that's not the way to run a society. You run a society by democratically electing people to govern you and to do the job they're meant to do. And if you don't do that, then this is just a sort of a stopgap arrangement. It doesn't result in any fundamental social change, right? So.
All right, so I think I'll ask one more question, then we'll see if anybody has any questions from the audience. So we've talked about this question before. This is a question about critique, right? So one criticism of your book might be, that critique is only destructive. So, in the second half of the book, you write about animals, people, and you write about the beast and fire in the sea, these texts, and you offer a critique of them and the ways that they are sort of insufficient in their what they're attempting to do. So someone might say, well, you're just sort of offering this destructive critique. You're not offering anything in place of this. You're not offering anything to take the place of or to correct what they've gotten wrong. But I want to ask you, what is the value of critique, right? And how are you choosing where you aim your critique, and how are you thinking about the purpose and utility of critique itself?
Okay, well, that's a interesting and complicated question. And I'm glad you think there's only one problem that might come up in the book, or with people asking about the book.
My brain is only capable of one.
Okay, all right. First of all, let me just say that before I talk about critique, that one of the things I think that has to happen, and this comes out of what I was saying in the previous response, is that human rights cannot be imposed from above. Human rights has to come from collective struggle. And knowledge should be produced from the social location in which that struggle is happening, right? I mean, I think I'm a great fan of standpoint theory, feminist standpoint theory, which argues that epistemic wisdom has to come from collective struggle and from marginalized communities. The idea that the oppressed has a more unclouded consciousness than the oppressor, and you can go back to Hegel and the slave master dialectic and Lukács's idea of the proletariat and so on and so forth. But you see things differently if you're oppressed, and that knowledge comes from that perspective. Fanos, wretched of the earth, right? Or even in our daily lives, when I approach this library versus someone who approaches this library in a wheelchair, we see this library entirely differently, right? And that's the standpoint of someone who is marginalized, who's oppressed, who's left out of the discourse, and I think that's where the discourse has to emerge from, not from foundations, not from organizations, not from organizations who think what's best for others, but through that fundamental struggle for freedom. So that's one thing I'll say. And as far as critique goes, I think I'm a great believer in doubt everything, right? I mean, you have to question not just systems of authority, but in a capitalist system, I mean, I think the assumption is that things appear to be how they are, but they're not. There's a whole world underneath, and that's what critique does. It lifts that that sort of veneer of sort of normalcy, and you see what's really there. And I think that's one of the reasons I value it, and I try to, in my professional and teaching life, try to, get students and my friends and colleagues to sort of just look through what appears to be common sense or what appears to be normal, because underneath that there are all kinds of systems and mechanisms working, and we have to uncover those mechanisms in order to change them. Mm-hmm. But if you can't see them, then you can't change them.
I said I was going to ask one. I'm going to ask one more. So is it fair then to say that critique is like, I want to say, does that mean that critique is actually part of praxis, or does it mean that critique is necessary for praxis?
I think they're both, they're intertwined. I mean, I think praxis without critique often results in something that is not transformative, not long-lasting, but critique in itself, just by itself, will only get you so far, So Marx's 11th thesis, philosophers have so far interpreted the world. The point, however, is to change it, right? So I think philosophers can interpret the world, but ultimately we have to change it if that's the goal of, particularly of human rights work, right?
Okay. Well, I will now open up the floor for questions from the audience. Does anybody have something that they would like to ask Dr. Chowdhury? And I got more questions if you don't have any questions, but yes, right here. Please, Paul.
Of course you do, Paula. Mm-hmm. Yeah. I mean, Zizek has this position, one I don't necessarily agree with, but he has the sense that human rights discourse is a sort of a false freedom, but in order to get to a true freedom, you have to go through that discourse, right? And so there are some ways in which you can kind of emerge from a discussion about empowerment. For instance, one of the things that really happened that interested me was a word that came out of a lot of the women's movement struggles in the 1960s was emancipation. And that word emancipation, how that went into empowerment, is a fascinating one, because emancipation was more associated with collective struggle, and empowerment gradually began to take on the association with individual upliftment. And that happens in a particular time. And I found that fascinating, again, because this is so much about language, right? But I think, yes, a lot of work can come out of negotiating or working your way through that kind of discourse. It doesn't necessarily have to be completely, thrown aside. And same thing with the UN Declaration. I think there are things there which have extreme, value, just as the Bill of Rights does, right? I mean, which is being shredded as we speak. but it does have a lot of value. Yeah.
Yeah, Olivia?
I'm just wondering, I don't know if it covers it on the book, but could you speak to the co-opting and borrowing of this language by, for example, corporations or by groups that are seeking to kind of capitalize on the popularity of some of these empowerment movements?
Yeah. I mean, it's everywhere. I mean, I'm sure there are other people in this room who can think of many examples off the top of their heads too. But I think empowerment is one, obviously. But I think companies that particularly want to highlight their sort of good work. You see Starbucks do this with coffee beans being produced in an ethical way and all of this stuff. But I think the more problematic sort of articulation of this is when again what is hidden in that process. So what is hidden in that process always is how are things produced? How is value produced? Where does value come from? And so what we see is this kind of appearance of things. When we hold that coffee in our hand, that's all it is. But we don't see the process by which that comes to us. And so a lot of corporations are, I think, using the language of, kind of, again, personal, individual sort of upliftment, empowerment, and they'll have a picture of someone, picking a coffee bean in some part of the world, and so that makes us feel better about, what we're doing and throwing away this into the trash after 5 minutes. I mean, one of the things we didn't talk about very much at all, but by the way, speaking of human rights, I think the big human rights crisis, of course, coming down the line is going to be climate change. I don't see how a whole new discourse cannot emerge out of this, and what's going to happen to climate refugees, and just the fact that so many people are losing their livelihoods from the effects of the rising oceans and the heating of the planet. I think that's going to be a huge next big discussion about rights language. Yeah.
I'm in a development economics course, and I've been wrestling this question, so I want to get your opinion on it. How do you view two sides of microlenders needing to be responsible and not giving loans that the people they give them to can't pay back, versus allowing the poor and ultra poor to make their own financial decisions?
Okay. Well, I think the conditions under which microloans are given is something that has to be really looked at. And I know a lot of microloans, for instance, come with very, very high interest rates sometimes, which are prohibitive and therefore very hard to pay back, and that puts people in very difficult situations. I mean, you ask a good question insofar as, because this is about agency, right? I mean, who gets to decide, first of all, what amount is appropriate, how you relay this amount, under what conditions these loans are given. But yes, I mean, I think ultimately the question is not so much whether what the responsibility of the lender is, but to really address the conditions under which this sort of transaction exists in the first place. Why are these transactions necessary? It is because the state has completely abdicated its responsibility to its own citizens. And so I think any development organization should work with the state, first of all, to change the conditions under which people are living, where they have to succumb to these kinds of very, very onerous situations sometimes of paying back loans. So I don't know if that answers your question, but I mean, it's something I'm still thinking through myself as well.
This might be kind of an odd question, but in what ways, and if you agree with this, I don't know, but in what ways do you see social media working against larger corporations?
Gosh, well, I know what Zuckerberg would say. That is, everything's good to go. I think, I mean, again, it's not an either or, right? I mean, I think social media has certainly had an impact on the way people have mobilized, and we've seen this from numerous examples in the last 10 years. However, again, this is where the danger of kind of surveillance and all these things come in, and you're seeing this play out with China and Hong Kong at the very moment in terms of who you don't want to upset, your relationship with the largest market on the planet, and yet you stand for free expression and all of these things. So it's a vexed relationship, but it's not an either or for me. I think social media has a particular role to play, but the problem is most of the avenues of working through social media is owned by large corporations, and therefore the information that is available and how that information comes to us is always going to be under the auspices of somebody for whom profit is the ultimate aim. And if that's the ultimate aim, then we have a problem, right? I don't think it's a coincidence that Zuckerberg has taken the position he has, because I think he knows that once he says, what is a lie, it opens the door for all kinds of restrictions, which he doesn't want. So yeah, it's a problematic platform for many reasons. Yeah.
So much of this human rights discourse seems to exist because of the failing of government,
Mm-hmm.
as you noted. To what degree is it appropriate for the global West and for NGOs out of the West to interfere with the global South to aid these crises if the governments won't do so?
Yeah, I mean, that's a good question. I mean, now you're asking a question about the politics of aid, right? And where does that, how does one do that ethically? So, for instance, many of the situations where, countries desperately need aid, how does one do that responsibly? It's one of those situations where I think because of the existing political inequality, countries that receive aid have very little power to dictate the terms of that aid, and that aid almost always comes with all kinds of conditions. And therefore it becomes, so for instance, the example I gave about social spending, so it's very, very often that aid will come with the condition that you cut your budget in certain areas in order to, make this possible to pay back. And obviously that is very problematic when money comes with those kinds of conditions. I think that maybe I would go back from your question further and ask the question, why is this country destabilized in the first place? And if you look hard enough, there's going to be some sort of causal factors that have to do with policies, either of international organizations or foreign policies of other countries, and so on and so forth. So the fact that a country needs aid is already always determined by something that has come prior to that. And I think that's what we need to look at, rather than, because otherwise it just becomes a question of should we give aid or not, and how should we do it ethically. I think the larger question is, why does a country need aid, right? And I'm not sure if I'm skirting your question, but I just want to complicate it a bit, because I think then it doesn't just become an issue of the ethics of aid giving or microcredit or whatever, but why do these conditions exist in the first place? Yeah. Oh, sorry. I don't know. Okay, I'm not exactly sure what your question is, but are you asking about American sort of intervention in other countries and whether that's okay on human rights? Well, gosh, I think there's somebody in the people in this room who can teach a course in that. But and you mentioned Latin America, of course. This is the United States' record in Latin America is atrocious when it comes to intervention and aiding and abetting in the violation of human rights. I think that if I can speak above that heater,
It's part of the charm of this room.
I would say that yeah, I mean, I'm absolutely, obviously against that kind of, intervention in terms of human rights. I mean, I think if you look at U.S. history, it has almost always been problematic in the way it's intervened, whether it's, I mean, the obvious examples in the last 3 or 4 decades would be, Chile again with the overthrow of the Allende regime, but many, many examples, Guatemala, El Salvador, and you can go on and on, Haiti. I think in order for the United States to be taken seriously in the realm of human rights, it has to be consistent. And it has not been consistent. In short, it has allowed terrible violations of human rights by regimes to go unanswered and be acceptable. And when a regime has not suited its purposes, it has then attacked its human rights record. You can't do it that, I mean, you have to be consistent. When Saddam Hussein is your friend and is fighting Iran, you can't support it. And then the moment he turns against you, suddenly he becomes the devil. You have to be consistent, otherwise people will not take your foreign policy seriously, right? If the Duvaliers have killed thousands of people in Haiti, we should not support them for 30 years and suddenly, try to bring Aristide back from Haiti. So it has to be consistent. I think foreign policy, whatever, not just the United States, but any country that claims to be interested in human rights has to consistently work to address those in any instance, even when it's against your own national interests. Either you're going to do this seriously or you're not, and no one's going to take you seriously if you don't do it that way. The United States has to have credibility in the world. Then that's one thing it has to do. It has to be consistent.
I'm going to take one final question from Teresa since I called on her before. So go ahead.
So you mentioned climate change. My question is, what's next? You've done all this study. Where is inquiry has opened for you that you want to dig a little bit more?
Well, I'm really now interested in the current migrant situation, and I'm kind of, as you know, I'm interested in just the politics of the border and immigration and things like that. But I don't know. I think this goes back to something you asked me before, and that is when you have so many different things you're interested in, how do you focus on something? And I think what often happens is that my students do the work for me. They get me interested in things. I'm just very fortunate to have students, and I'd say this semester, both my undergraduate and graduate class. It's the students who give me ideas, and the conversations we have, the discussions we have. They've always been the biggest kind of inspiration for me to think about things. So I don't think I have anything pre-planned. I think something will emerge from those conversations. Yeah.
I think that's a good place to end. How about a round of applause for Dr. Chowdhury?
Thank you.